Hello, my name is Lauren Sabo, Curriculum Specialist at Clayton Middle School, and I'm here to talk to you today about candidate-centered support for National Board Certification. Our first topic we will discuss will be how to prepare to work with candidates. Most candidates in Johnston County this year have completed a series of sessions with me about directions of the process, the standards, the three types of writing, and specific strategies for each entry. The next two sessions, NBCTs will be asked to read candidates' specific entries to provide individualized feedback. Ethics. When reading, we do need to adhere to certain ethical guidelines. Although we are all professional and would never purposely act unethically, we can sometimes make decisions when working with candidates that we view as being helpful, but actually is seen as unethical based on the guidelines of the National Board. For example, we must remember that this is their certification and we are simply promoting their ownership of it. We cannot make choices for candidates or create evidence for candidates. Instead, we as candidate support providers need to just skillfully probe the candidates for deeper thinking. We also need to honor and respect the choices and decisions of the National Board candidate, even if we do not agree with them. It is important for you to review the National Board website and review the directions and standards for your certificate area, as they may have changed since you have gone through the process. We need to remember that this is a process about learning to be a better reflective practitioner. We want to help candidates discover the skills necessary to make that happen, but we do not want to tell them a formula for achieving National Board certification. Be sure to read the guidelines for ethical candidate support prior to working with any candidates. Those can be found at the website www.nbpts.org. So let's look at some myths surrounding candidate support ethics. First, it is okay to talk about the questions at the assessment center once the testing period is closed. That is a myth. If any candidates ask you anything specific about the assessment center, your portfolios, your videos, it is not okay to discuss. Our portfolio and the things that we did are completely off limits. Next myth. Candidates should send their entry to as many people as possible so that they can be sure to get as much help as possible. That is also a myth. We want to only read for a candidate 2 times. We read it once and offer feedback. We read it a second time to offer feedback on the revisions. Too many reads after that, then our feedback becomes coaching as opposed to probing for that self-discovery. So, even if a candidate does not want to get tons and tons of NBCTs to read for them, but they also do not want one particular NBCT to read an entry more than just a couple of times. Next myth. Candidates should remove the students with behavior problems from their classes before they record a video. That is a myth. Videos are nothing more than a reflection of our description in the written context and planning and instruction sections of the portfolio. Assessors are looking to see if the video provides consistent evidence between what we've written and what is shown. If the video shows behavior problems, those should be described in the written context and addressed under the planning and instruction. If there are interruptions in the video, such as an intercom or a visitor to the classroom, that simply shows the reality of our daily teaching life. What is important on a video is that it provides rich evidence of the standards, follows the directions given in the entry, and that the students and teacher can be seen and heard clearly. Myth. Candidates always benefit from looking at video recordings of high scoring NBCTs. I always share mine at the first meeting. Again, as we've already discussed, we are not allowed to share any of our work with candidates. Okay, so let's talk about setting boundaries. First of all, again, don't share your portfolio. Avoid grading, judging, or scoring an entry. That part is very important. It is very important not to tell a candidate anything like, I think this is really good, or I think this will score a 3. It's okay to say things like, I find lots of evidence for the questions, but it is not okay to tell them something specific because that could always come back later to haunt you. Don't feel accountable for a candidate's success or failure. Resist making choices for candidates. Avoid the halo effect. This is very important if you are working with a candidate that you personally know. You don't want to say things like, well, I know what they meant, or I know that they're a good teacher, so that's probably clear. If you cannot read enough evidence in a candidate's entry to make it clear to anyone, then you need to suggest to the candidate that they need to provide more clear and consistent evidence. Provide directional tips for the candidate, but leave the decision making up to the candidate. So you can tell them things to help them just follow the directions more clearly, but don't make decisions for them. As we've said, avoid reading an entry more than 2 times and don't ever say that's good. Here are some possible consequences of misconduct when working with a candidate, so it is very important that we follow these guidelines. Okay, so when we're working with a candidate, we want to make sure that we are providing positive feedback. Candidates will be defensive about their work. They may at times appear frustrated and or sad. So it is important for us to be sensitive to their feelings and emotions, but it is also important for us to provide constructive feedback in an honest and clear way. You don't want to resist telling a candidate your honest feelings for fear of hurting their feelings. We are here to probe their thinking and help them to become better teachers. So it is important for us to be as honest as possible. We are there to encourage that reflective thinking and self discovery, and our conversations should be focused on the promotion of those areas. Here are some strategies that you can use to encourage reflective thinking. Um, Ask them these questions based on the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards that can be found on the website. And yes, it would be easier just to tell a candidate what you would do, but then you're robbing them of the opportunity to make discoveries about their own practice and robbing them of the opportunity to grow as a professional. All right, so in the next section, we're going to prepare ourselves for the work with candidates. So, the purpose of our feedback is to promote professional growth, allow candidates to process their own thinking, to maintain the integrity of the process, and to preserve candidates' ownership of their work. Anytime you are working with candidates, make sure that you are keeping the 5 core propositions in mind and focus on those 5 core propositions. They frame the work of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. They frame the standards. They frame how we support our candidates, and they frame how we probe for critical thinking. Remember what they are. Teachers are committed to students and their learning. Teachers know the subjects they teach and how to teach it. And there's some questions there just for you to think about your work with candidates and how those also frame the core propositions. Teachers are responsible for managing and monitoring student learning. Teachers think systematically about their practice and learn from experience. And teachers are members of learning communities. All right, so let's talk about some myths for communicating effectively with candidates. Myth one: candidates should put their portfolio questions in their entries and reference the standards directly so the scorers will be able to identify the evidence. Um, you do not have to have the portfolio questions written out. You do not need to necessarily say things like, Standard 1 tells me to blah, blah, blah. It is important to use language from the standards, and it is important to make sure that all of our decisions are based on the evidence of the standards. But again, there's not a right or wrong way to complete National Board certification. As long as you can find answers to the questions that are rich in evidence from the standards, then the candidate is fine. Myth two: candidates need to go through the process the same way the candidate support provider did. Again, a myth. There's not a right or wrong way to do this, and there's not a formula. Um, Myth: if candidates disagree with their candidate support provider, candidates should look for a new candidate support provider who is a better fit. One thing that we don't want to see is NBCT hopping. Once you begin working with a candidate, stay the course. We do not want candidates hopping from one of us to the other until they find someone who agrees with all of their decisions. If our feedback is grounded in evidence from the standards and the guidelines for national boards, then any one of us should give a candidate the same kind of answer or the same kind of feedback. Next myth: a candidate support provider who scored a 4 on an entry is the best one to help a candidate with that specific portfolio entry. That's a myth. Just because you scored highly on an entry does not necessarily mean that you would be able to give the best feedback for that candidate. Um, we also do not necessarily um, give the best feedback just because we achieved a higher score than another NBCT or took fewer times to submit our portfolio. Um, Feedback is grounded in us understanding the process ourselves. So we need to make sure that we understand all of ways to communicate effectively and all entry directions for our certificate area. Myth: candidates don't know what to do, so candidate support providers should share their terrific ideas with them. Again, we've already discussed this, and we need to just make sure that we're probing thinking for the candidates to help them arrive at those ideas for themselves. Okay, so here are some helpful tips. We, number one, want to make sure that candidates provide us with the questions for the entry. We want to read to be sure that all parts of the question have been described and analyzed. We want to review the scoring guides and rubrics for each entry so that we are familiar with them, and we may even want to review those with the candidate. If we do not understand something that is written, we need to tell the candidate. We don't want to just assume through that halo effect that we know what they mean and an assessor will too. Remember, we're looking for clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. Be sure that the candidate is using the three types of writing: descriptive, analytical, and reflective. Many times, candidates do a lot of describing, but do not do a lot of analyzing and reflecting. Remember, recognize that candidates may be searching for a candidate support provider to provide the answer and ensure what they are doing is right. Candidate support providers do not hold the magic answer that results in certification. We are simply there to help them probe their thinking, but we do not have all the magic answers. Use prompts and standards as your guide, and be aware that the prompts and standards may have changed since you certified. Always review that website for the latest information. When giving feedback, just highlight those areas that may not be clear or may require additional information. Provide positive suggestions that may help to improve the process. Follow those ethical guidelines and follow the code of care. Collaborative, analysis, and respect everyone. Okay, so here's some next steps. If you have any questions for me, you can add them to the wall at that website, padlet.com, or you can email me, Lauren Sabo at johnston.k12.nc.us, or you can email Tony Stewart at tonystewart at johnston, there's a little typo there, .k12.nc.us.